If you can capture the humanity of a family struggling in economic crisis, you can make a difference. You can raise awareness just of the simple humanity. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today: economy in turmoil. Is Sri Lanka on the brink of bankruptcy? Joining us this evening on the show are Murtha Jafaji, Chair, Advocata Institute; Dr. Annadas Bandaranaike, former Assistant Governor, Central Bank of Sri Lanka; Professor Udara Peris, Professor of Finance, National Research University, High School of Economics, Moscow, also a member of the Research Advisory Board of the Central Bank of Russia; Dr. Priyanka Durusingha, Senior Lecturer, Department of Economics, University of Colombo. Let's start off tonight's show with Dr. Annadas Bandaranaike, former Assistant Governor, Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Anna, interestingly, you've been attached to the Central Bank of Sri Lanka for the last 24 years. You've been retired for the last 15 years. We all are aware of that fact as well. What is the direction in which the Central Bank of Sri Lanka right now is moving forward? Because it seems to give negative signals. It seems to give amber signals to investors. It gives amber signals to the people of Sri Lanka. Given that fact, Anla, where do you think the Central Bank of Sri Lanka is heading right now?
Honestly, I have tried to rationalize the signals coming out of the Central Bank for the last, since I was last year. First of all, thank you for having me back again, since I was last year in June. And I honestly cannot understand where it is going or where it's coming from. There are so many negative signals, and there is no clear direction. And basically the central bank, which is responsible for maintaining the domestic and international stability of the rupee, has failed miserably. It is also responsible, I think there are 3 sections of the Monetary Law Act, and I think I brought that with me in case this question came up. Section 64(2), maintaining the money supply and the cost of living index. Under Section 68(1), international deficit in the international balance of payments, serious decline in the international reserve. They are responsible for doing something about it. Under Section 65, they are responsible for maintaining exchange arrangements consistent with the underlying trends in the country. And what we have seen, despite several assurances from the governor of the central bank that all is well, the situation has been deteriorating further and further and further. So I honestly cannot understand what is happening there. There seems to be no direction. And despite some people saying nice things about this 6-month roadmap, it seemed an utter confused jumble to me. If you looked at it, there were graphs and pictures, colors. It showed no direction. And I honestly don't know what they're doing. I don't think they know what they're doing. And it is very clear, I think 9 months ago, even before that, several people who are much more well-versed in economics than I am said, you have to look at the debt restructure, but they continued in a, pig-headedly, I would say, I'm sorry to use such a strong word, saying, yes, we can pay the loans, and then very proudly saying, look, we paid the last 500 million, but at what cost? There are no basic foods, pharmacy, medicines. Now we are paying 3 times for a cylinder of gas as we did, I think, just a few months ago. From 1,700, it's gone to 4,500. There's no fuel. There's vegetables rotting in the, and I'm not talking about things like the agricultural policy. That's not the central bank's business. So the inflation is, between 15 and 20%, rising further. So neither on the stability of the rupee in the domestic market nor in the international market have we succeeded. Reserves are down to zilch, and they're still spouting some nonsense. So I honestly don't know. My answer is I cannot figure out, and I honestly cannot see how the members of the monetary board sleep at night.
Dr. Anila, now the central bank governor, Ajit Niwal Cabral, said that Sri Lanka does not need to go to the IMF and a homegrown solution was adequate to deliver the desired results. However, the attitude now has changed significantly. What is the reason behind this?
Their back is to the wall. They have no choice anymore. They are still spouting, false bravado, but they have got to a point where they now have to do what every sane person was telling the country to do months ago. I've heard Murtaza on this. I'm sure the economists will have something to say, and I think now they have no options because we have to restructure our debt. There is no doubt about it. I don't think you can talk about correct me if I'm wrong, the others on the panel, I don't think you talk about a country being bankrupt. A country can always, government can always pay its own debt by printing more money, which is what has been happening. And in the case of international, you can default or you can, in a dignified way, restructure and postpone. And now, and after saying, no, we are not going to do it, now they have had to do it. I don't think for any rational thinking or logical progression of thought. I think because now there is no choice. You do not have enough reserve. I mean, can you imagine a country where the electricity board is telling people they have no paper to print the bills? I don't know whether you heard about that. I think it's in the papers that the exams in the schools can't be held because they have no money to bring paper pulp into the country. Right. So, so they have no choice. I think the short answer is their back is to the wall. They're still trying to put this false bravado face. They have no choice. The exchange rate, I should mention one thing. This exchange rate keeping it at $201 billion we lost between 2020 and 2021, the second half, once they kept that thing at 203, it shot to 200 and then they brought it down. Migrant remittances went down by $1 billion in 10 months. From $700 million per month, it's gone down to, I think, under 300. Am I right? Yeah. Under 300. 1 billion. We'd have had enough from migrant remittances to pay that wretched 500 million that we paid in January. So they stuck to this 200 and offering some piddly 10 rupees extra to the migrants. Migrants are not fools. They just sent it through the Hawala system. The banking system had got no money. Then they had to let go.
Tail between the legs, Dr. Anila, is that the attitude of the government now?
No, there is no tail. There's lots of false bravado going down. Oh, no, we thought of this all along. I don't think there's ever going to be a tail between the legs. But I don't think they have come to this, what do you call it, floating the exchange rate because of an irrational thought. I think it's because they have no choice.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Anidas Bandaranaike, former Assistant Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Tonight on the show, we are also joined by several activists who will also voice their opinion with regard to the country's economic situation as to how they see with regard to the cost of living and so on and so forth. We'll get them on board momentarily as the show goes on. I want to now focus my attention on Murtaza Jafferji, Chair of the Advocata Institute. Murtaza, several months ago when you were on this very show, you said, we are yet to be in the ICU. There is so much more to do. We have to get ourselves and make sure that we get our act together in order to face all the issues that we face in the future. Then I asked you a question. I asked you, we are a very resilient nation and we've never gone wrong. We've always come on top. But it seems to me that that prediction that I made at that time proved wrong. What is your opinion with regard to the future of the country's economy now? Do you see any glimmer of hope? Do you see any reversal to the situation that we're experiencing at present?
So, in one sense, Shamir, ironically, I am actually more hopeful now than I have ever been in my whole working life. And I will elaborate later on in your show why. Is that we are having the kind of crash that we have never had in post-independence Sri Lanka. And a crisis of this nature should never be wasted, that it is an opportunity of a generation to reset this country so that coming out of the ashes, as I said in your program, like a phoenix we will rise. But for us to come up, we need some basic sustenance in the economy. We have become so weak that people are fighting for daily survival. So we will have to take some strict action in the very short term, what economists call macro stabilization, so that we can steady the ship and chart a new course for this ship to sail.
Murtaza, is there an excess of money in the market at present? Because we saw a lot of printing of money taking place over the last few months. Is that why people are yet to face the pinch?
Yeah. So let's give you some anecdotal evidence. The central bank, I believe, brought out a report yesterday, amongst many of the other statistical data that they release periodically, about the condominium market. Now, condominium market, the sales at the end of last quarter were at record levels. An economy that has been distressed for a very long time cannot be posting this kind of economic data. You should be having very weak demand. Now, my day job is working in the stock market, and therefore one of the benefits of that job is that I get to speak and interview number of listed companies across many different businesses. And to my recollection, I don't recollect a single of the CFOs or CEOs ever telling us that there was a problem with demand. That all the companies were facing very strong demand. They had supply issues, right? And anecdotally, most people say that you cannot get a seat at a restaurant. That Thursday, Friday, Saturday, most of the restaurants in the city of Colombo, which is frequented by much more wealthier class of people, they were full. So quite literally, one indication of money printing could be this excess amount of demand in the economy, and that is evidenced by this anecdotal. But if you look at the figures themselves, over the period 2020 and 2021, which is a post-COVID period, the nominal GDP in the country grew by 10%, right? But the broad money grew by 40%. And the currency in circulation grew by 57%. So that is indicative that there was excessive money creation in the economy. Now you asked a question about money printing, which has a colloquial and literal definition. The colloquial definition is that that you basically have the central bank creating monetary expansion instead of it being created by the banks. So normally money creation happens when a bank makes a loan which becomes a deposit in somebody's account. But if that is being done by the central bank, what happens is the base money expands, and therefore the rate of monetary expansion accelerates excessively, and that creates monetary stability. So in this particular case, in the year 2021, they were trying to artificially suppress interest rates. So we had a series of treasury bill auctions where the interest rates were like 5%, 5.5%. And if you look at the auction results, if they were advertising, say, for 60 billion rupees, the market was providing them a quantum much lower than that 60 billion rupees. And the balance was being provided by the central bank. So in that particular case, there was quite literally money printing by the central bank. But a lot of journalists sometimes have got confused with the significant expansion in the rupee base of the central bank, which is also symptomatic of the fact that the dollar base of assets have reduced. So if the net foreign assets of the central bank comes down, the net domestic assets have to go up. So all of that change was not due to money printing, but there certainly was money printing.
But do you think, Murtaza, in any way that the government's decision to restrict the importation of 300 plus goods to Sri Lanka a couple of days ago or weeks ago would result in a positive impact towards the country's economy, or would it also have a negative impact overall because of the fact that people have money excessively right now in their pockets?
Yeah, so that is a strategy that they have repeatedly done it's like, you know, trying to do the same thing over and over again, as Einstein said, and expecting a different outcome is a sign of insanity, basically. So what is happening here is they are saying this is essential, non-essential, banning. So what happens is that you create distortions in the market, black economies, etc. As I explained earlier, that we have an excess amount of demand. There are two instruments that you can use to taper excess demand in the economy. Either you have to do that through monetary policy, which means increase interest rates, increase real interest rates to dissuade people from borrowing and spending, either consumption or investment, or incentivize people to save. The other tool is to use fiscal policy. That means you tax, either directly or indirectly, reducing disposable income of households and people and businesses. That is what they should be focusing on. What happens is that when you start putting bans, restrictions, etc., that money still exists. But it's going to go somewhere.
Yeah, but Murtaza, the finance minister met several economists attached to Advocate Institute as well, and you all made a presentation to the Minister of Finance. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, there was a discussion.
Right.
I was also there. It was not for an extensive period of time because I had to leave a bit earlier. But the focus more was about the debt rather than these matters.
Right, okay. Thank you very much. Murtaza Jafarji, Chair of the Advocate Institute. We now move our attention to Dr. Priyanka Dinusingha, Senior Lecturer, Department of Economics, University of Colombo. Dr. Dinusingha, I want to drag your attention to the statement that was made by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa last Wednesday. He says, our country is not the only country in the world affected by the prevailing crisis situation. The entire world is engulfed with various hardships. What do you gather from this statement made by the President? Is it trying to whitewash the government's problems and make sure that they reign on top? Or does he think the people don't realize what's happening across the world? What is your take?
Yeah, I think to a certain extent it is quite clear that President wants to say that this is what you experience is normal, and in around other countries also, you know, similar situation prevail. To a certain extent it is true that with the pandemic, some, in particular the low income countries around the world witness some difficulties, but certainly not to the extent that we witness here. That I think here we witness it to a greater extent. In those countries in particular, they lost some jobs and they witness some sort of increase in prices, but inflation still remain below 2 digit. Now in Sri Lanka we have say inflation is around 16%, whereas the food inflation remain about 10 over 1.5 years. Right now in the last month it was around 25%. So even though the President tried to say that this is normal, this is what most of the people in the world witness, but it is quite, I think, opposite. So here in Sri Lanka, things are really, really difficult.
So when the President said that this crisis was not created by me, what did you think about that statement?
Again, I agree to some extent because the current crisis, if you look into its sources, some of the structural weaknesses in the economy that certainly prevailed even before economic liberalization in 1977 is responsible. In addition, the pandemic also has its share, and more than, I think, in addition to that, poor economic management of the current government, I think, need to basically take the bigger share of the current crisis.
Because Dr. Dinusingha, if you look at it, many economists, like individuals like Murtaza, then we had Fitch ratings downgrading Sri Lanka far more ahead, and we knew something of this sort is going to come to play, and the government did not heed to any of these warning signals. Do you agree?
Yes, certainly. I think if you look at the people who are in the decision making with respect to the economic matters, if I put this in a simple way, the Ministry of Finance as well, Minister of Finance as well as the central bank governor, I think to a great extent they did not understand this the complicated situation and the possible consequences of due to any what would be the difficult situations that could arise due to ongoing crisis. On the other hand, they did not listen to the that what you call the experts in the field, and I do not say that the central bank you have educated the subject experts, Ministry of Finance and the other responsible government entities. They have good, very good policy makers or the experts in the field, and they know what to do in a situation of this, and they certainly have advice. But what happened is those advices were not implemented by the political authority or the responsible people.
But Dr. Dunasinghe, when you have members of the government who are strongmen saying that we have rupees, however, we have a slight problem with US dollars. What are these ministers trying to do? Are they trying to appease the masses of this country by lying again and again?
Exactly, that is what they are trying to do. Over the years, what they did, if you look at, they lied a lot, no? Even at a crisis of this nature, I also saw that particular statement saying that we have enough rupees. We have only the issue with the dollars.
And this minister in question is in this celebrated economic council appointed by the president.
Yes, yes.
Very unfortunate. Aren't we unfortunate, Dr. Dunasinghe?
Certainly we are unfortunate
as a nation.
Definitely, that is exactly what the Dr. Kumarasamy mentioned, that his generation has failed in putting the country in a correct path.
Right.
So that is what has happened.
So thank you very much, Dr. Priyanka Dunasinghe, a senior lecturer at Department of Economics, University of Colombo. When you hear these thoughts that are being projected by our panelists, what is the future holds for younger generations like us? Unfortunate, very unfortunate indeed. I want to focus my attention now on Professor Udara Peris, a professor of finance, National Research University, High School of Economics, Moscow. He's also a member of the Research Advisory Board of the Central Bank of Russia. Udara, I would like to pose some questions to you with regard to the conflict in Russia as well, but we will do that momentarily as the show goes on. What are the effects that we have as a nation, like the subcontinent? However, our topic of discussion today is about the country's economic crisis. So let's talk a little bit about the debt restructuring. You've been very vocal, Udara, with regard to debt restructuring. And you say that there needs to be a path of confidence and hope for the country. But I want to drag your attention to what happened recently. Let's take a look at the debt situation in the country. Just last week, media reports that Sri Lanka has settled 130 million US dollars of Chinese debt. And now this comes in the light in wake of the Chinese ambassador's statement that Sri Lanka has sought 2.5 billion US dollars financial assistance from China. Now I'm trying to figure out who is our friend, who is our enemy.
So firstly, thank you for having me on the show. I think it's a very important discussion to be having right now. So let me start with your last statement about who is a friend and enemy. So there's a saying, like politics and business, there are no friends or enemies. And I think that's the realistic, practical approach we should be taking with regards to debt. We should do what's best for the country, regardless of who it is. Now, with regards to this particular transaction, I think this, to me, is consistent with the pattern of what the government is trying to do, which is essentially replace the existing stock of external debt through multilateral loans or bilateral loans with sovereigns. This has the benefit that you have a partner, a strong partner, a friend who's willing to supply these loans, but it doesn't resolve the fundamental problem. So you said with regards to the title of the show today that is the country bankrupt. So I agree with Anila that the word bankruptcy is really not the right word to be using. I think the appropriate word to be using is insolvent. So by insolvent I mean we haven't got the ability to repay these external loans with our current tax base, and the current tax base with respect to our current level of exports. Okay. Now, we already discussed briefly with Murtaza that the issue of cutting imports. So suppose that we just have a complete cutting of all imports, then we have a certain amount of exports, and we can effectively tax this to an extent and then repay the government debt. Now, if you think about what is a realistic set of policies we can do and realistic set of tax revenue we can get from this, is still not going to be an amount which is sufficient to be able to repay the stock of debt. At the moment, my calculations, I'm happy to be corrected, the total amount of tax revenue to government finances is around in the range of 35%. There's a number of 80% that was quoted, but it's somewhere in this range. And if you look at most countries that have gone into debt restructuring, it's been countries that have been in this sort of range. Sri Lanka is in much more... In some ways, what's happened in Sri Lanka is very common. So I'm happy to go back to this issue later. You know, when I speak to my friends and colleagues that have dealt with different debt crises in other countries, they say, ha ha ha, this is what happened in all the other countries. So going back to this specific question you had about the Chinese debt, this is a nice way to prolong the problem, but the fundamental problem of insolvency needs to be dealt with.
Right. So, Udara, right now the biggest question mark in my head at the moment is, we have sought assistance from the IMF with regard to getting some assistance with regard to the program, with regard to financial assistance in the country. Then you have the governor of the central bank very steadfastly saying, we will pay that $1 billion in July. But I don't know what his stand is now, because he's not come on the media since the president's statement recently. Why did we go ahead and pay this $130 million debt repayment to China when we could have easily gone for a restructuring process of our debt?
Okay, so with regards to restructuring of debt, the way this should be done and the correct way, the clean way to do this, is to get all of your lenders together in the table and to speak transparently with all of them at once about what you want to achieve from the process. I read an article in, I think, the Daily Mirror, where they quoted with this particular transaction that the Chinese were not willing to talk about renegotiation. The issue of renegotiation was discussed. The Chinese were not willing to engage because they wanted to know what the other lenders were doing. And that's going to be the same response if you keep going one by one to your lenders and ask them, do you want to reduce my debt? And say, why me? Why not the other people here? So the only way to deal with this is systematically and to get everyone at the table. And the role of the IMF is, of course, it's a lender of last resort. They can provide credit lines, short-term debt. They can even provide additional financial system. But the much more powerful role of the IMF is to provide a mechanism to bring all the lenders around and to bring home an agreement that they can commit to. And this agreement is two-sided. One is that the lenders are willing to take a cut. And the second side, which is more problematic, is that our government is willing to commit to a path of fiscal consolidation. And the IMF is the entity that has the credibility that can bring these both sides together.
Thank you very much, Udara Paris, Professor of Finance, National Research University of Higher School of Economics, Moscow. I want to open the floor for questions from our journalists. On to my immediate right is Nadim. On to my immediate left is Faraz Shaukat Ali, who is the host of Newsline, today sitting on Face the Nation. Thank you very much, Faraz, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation. But very quickly, before I move on to either Nadim or Faraz, let's quickly hear what Angelo De Silva, who is a member of public, who has been staging protests in Sri Lanka week in and week out. Angelo, tell us, what is your frustration like? You've been doing this for the last couple of weeks. what is it like for you as a member of the public to come out to the streets? Because I don't think individuals of your caliber have come to the streets before, but this time, dire economic situation in the country, and that has meant dire consequences for individuals like you as well. Why did you decide to come to the streets?
First of all, thanks a lot for having me on this evening. Yes, it's quite dire, and like you rightly said, I don't think forgive me for using this term, the Colombo crowd has really taken to the streets in a consistent way in recent history. It hasn't happened. And a few weeks ago, when a group of like-minded individuals decided to stand up for this, I decided to join them. And this has been a movement that has been fueled by individuals taking accountability to come out and protest the mismanagement that they at the end are paying for. So all of us, actually, it is quite dire, because I hear all this eminent panel of economists and financial experts speaking, and we often hear numbers such as 15% and 20% of inflation and restructuring of debt and all of that. But at the end of the day, my gas has gone up by 100%. My milk powder has gone up by 100%. For me, there are no 15, 20% numbers anywhere on the table. Everything is 100% more. And I'm a small business owner. I employ people. I provide jobs. I'm one of the first in my generation to start businesses here in Sri Lanka. And I regret that today. I regret that deeply. And it is very saddening for me to say this, but it has to be said. We are finding it difficult to look at our staff, look at them and pay them the same salary that they were getting last year, which is quite shocking, because salaries do increase, and they do increase in incremental percentages. But now we are looking at especially small companies where your staff is very close to you, where you don't have the luxury of having layers between you of various managers to shield you from the ground level reality. You need to answer to your people, and you need to actually sit and converse with them as to why their salaries need to be increased by 100%.
Yeah, so Angelo, very quickly, before I open the floor for questions from our journalists. Now, you say that you are an entrepreneur, you are an owner of
Yes.
a business organization as well. If
Yes.
you are to look at giving an increment in the month of April, which is usually the normal format for many corporates across the world, or in Sri Lanka for that matter, what would be the considerable increment that you would consider to your employees, given the current cost of living? Mind you, you have to also look after your interests as a business owner as well, because at the end of the day, you can only sustain your business if you make profits.
Exactly. So I am no economist, but I'm stuck in a sandwich. I describe it as a sandwich. Our costs have gone up significantly. We don't have any margins left to really increase salaries. And of course, salaries contribute to a very small percentage of overall costs of any business, I would say, especially if you have raw materials and manufacturing coming into play. But here we are looking at not the usual 10 to 15% increment. You asked me a question, and the answer to that is at least 50% or even more.
Right.
And it also depends on the salary.
Yeah.
Small businesses have people earning in the range of about 45,000 to 50,000.
Thanks a lot, Angelo. Mind you, many corporates in Sri Lanka lost billions of rupees as a result of the government's deciding overnight to float the exchange rate. And as a result of that, the LCs that were signed by many corporates at a certain amount of fixed rate at 203 rupees now have to pay 209 rupees. Who are they supposed to palm off that amount of cost inflation? Is it to the public? I open the floor for questions. Faraz.
Thank you. This question is to Dr. Anila. Can you tell us, Doctor, what would you suggest, say 3 points that the government should undertake immediately?
First of all, I think to me the most important thing is the situation of the people. Murtaza talks about the business community and the listed companies. Those are very small portion of the entire economy. So I think, first of all, the government has to they have to ensure that there is professionalism, that the people who are supposed to do these jobs are accountable, and they have to take action. And I think heads have to roll. If I don't agree with what the president said, that he is not responsible. He is the executive. If he has appointed people to certain positions and they have not fulfilled their responsibilities under the act under which they are appointed, they have to be removed, and people who can do the job must be put in. So one, I think accountability has to come into the system. Two, there is no shortcut. This is going to be a very difficult time for this country. Everybody has to belt tighten and suffer, at least in the short term to medium term, till we right ourselves. As Udar said, you can't keep on postponing. So I think that belt tightening has to come, at the same time protect the vulnerable, the most vulnerable. So one is accountability. Let heads roll of those who did not satisfy their responsibilities under whatever authority they were given, and that applies to the finance ministry officials and to the central bank officials. And I mean, these people, those institutions are full of good people, so you have to take those at the head to be responsible. One. Two, tell the people and start the belt tightening. The inflation is not going to come down in a hurry, even the exchange rate, because too little, too late. It's very volatile, but hopefully it will stabilize. And the third point is, I think this is not going to be easy. We have neglected our systems. When I say protect the vulnerable, nobody today knows who the vulnerable are, because the information is not there. There is an income and expenditure survey, which the data are not out yet. There is a poverty line, right? I'm talking about the lower end of the income spectrum. We have a poverty line today that is 20 years, the consumption basket is 20 years old. It's based on 2002, they've been splicing, and it tells you that currently, to be above the poverty line, every individual needs only 6,000 rupees a month. That is 200 rupees a day. One cup of tea and one loaf of bread for the day, no money else for anything else. That is our poverty line. I mean, this is a joke. So we have to get the information out. Nobody is asking, neither the private sector, nor government entities, nor the ministers are asking what is the information available. So I think those systems, so there has to be a focus on, the three things will be, as I said, accountability. Two, tightening the belts and explaining to the people that, solutions are not going to come from heaven, and find out who are vulnerable are, the poor, the disabled, the elderly, the children. Census. We have to have we should have had a census this year.
But Dr. Anila, if I was to say to you, what three things should be done to in terms of the dollar crisis?
The dollar crisis.
Because everything
we've already done the managing of the exchange rate. At the same time, the other things have to come. Just managing, floating the rate are not enough. We have to bring in the fiscal now. We have to bring back the revenue, 8% to GDP, right? 8% to 71% of the revenue is spent on interest payments.
Would you
we have to raise taxes.
Would you go for reversing the tax break that
reverse the withholding, bring back withholding tax, bring back pay. Look at the what do you call it, the thresholds for VAT, and this is not the right time, but when is the right time? They are up, as somebody said, look at the vehicles on the road, look at the spoke about restaurants. At the upper end, right, there is money. People are putting money in condominiums. You have to tax the rich who can afford, who are going through this without really, standing in a queue for a little while to get the petrol. But what about all the cash that's going into all this consumption? I'm not a communist or a socialist, but you have to tax from somewhere the people who can afford to pay.
Dr. Anila, the problem is right now, your sentiments are very well noted, because at the end of the day, if revenue has to generate from somewhere.
Exactly.
And you have to take action. But for how long? Now you say tightening belts of individuals. We have to, as a nation, tighten our belts. We've done this over and over again.
Not
at what cost?
At what? But we have not. Now look at the IMF thing. We have gone through so many IMF programs, but those are tiding over balance of payments crises. But at the same time, the structural reforms have to come in. We have to look at the labor market. We have to look at the education system. We have to look at the environmental issues. We have to put some basic systems in place, which will take a while.
No, but let's take a look at what happened during the recent past, Dr. Anila.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the government went ahead and appointed an economic council. Then the government appointed another economic council to advise this particular economic council in question. Now, this economic council was appointed recently, and this economic council proposes 5 points to President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and Finance Minister Basil Rajapaksa. Now, look at these 5 proposals. Appoint another technical committee consisting of officials from both the central bank and the treasury to propose international financial assistance. Point number 1. Point number 2, appoint a financial advisor and a legal advisor. Point number 3, the technical committee must immediately submit a restructuring program pertaining to international financial assistance and appoint a group of experts to coordinate with the finance minister. What is this, Dr. Anila?
May I respond to that?
Yes, please. What is
okay.
this?
First of all, I'm sorry, but one can't laugh. This is a real tragicomedy in this country. I was told that, I can't remember where I heard this is hearsay, that somebody who had offered assistance to the president had been told that he had said that he has 200 advisors. 200 advisors.
We had one advisor walking out last week.
200 advisors. One. Anybody who needs 200 advisors does not know whether he's coming or going. And that is clear from the state of the country. Secondly, when you look at this, no offense meant to any other people on the advisors to the economic council, but it's an economic council. Business people don't look at the big picture. They will look at their bottom line and their profit and where the exchange rate will be. We are talking about people's lives, socio-economic issues. So there's one very good, I don't want to mention names, very good economist there. I looked at the list. There was one name that was consistent with another economist academic, but I found it's somebody else, not the academic economist. It's another business person. So that council that's advising is all business people who are dealing at the upper end, who may be paying from $200 to $290, but who are at a different level. So you must get people who understand policy to advise the advisors.
Dr. Anila,
first of all, you don't need 2 layers if the council knows what they are doing, So it's all nonsense.
Dr. Anila, one of the problems...
These are people, this is a situation where, and I'm sorry to be so blunt, this is a situation where nobody knows where they're heading. They don't want to ask advice from the people who know. And every single, I don't read the newspapers because I get depressed. I don't watch the TV, but people send me forwards of programs. There are so many experts in agriculture.
This is like the J.R. Jayawardena government era, where they appoint committees after committees, restructure the party.
The people who know are giving talks on programs in Sinhala, in Tamil, in English. They are writing to the newspapers in 3 languages. But I don't see any of them on these councils.
One of the problems that we see, that the reason that the country is in this situation is the prevalence of rent-seeking businesses in Sri Lanka. Dr. Anila was talking about, people not paying their taxes. Then the flip side of it is you have businesses that are essentially propped up by taxpayer rupees, by taxpayer monies, and these are what you call basically rent-seeking. And these are some of the biggest industries domestically in the country. Can you expect persons from rent-seeking or rent-seeking business persons to give you independent advice on how to restructure your economy?
I rest my case.
So the answer is obviously no. And basically the mantra has been private profits, socialized losses. And that has been a mantra for many decades. So the question that you ask is that the proponents of the alternate model and the proponents of the tax stimulus have been massively beneficial for these crony capitalists, because my belief is that capitalism is the greatest thing to uplift people's life, because the foundation of capitalism is profit seeking but under highly competitive economic system. It is through competition and profit seeking that innovation happens, through which profits get reinvested for economic expansion. But what is happening now is that we have created a class of crony capitalists.
Who are actively preventing competition in our economy.
And crony capitalists have done state capture. So there is institutional and state capture that has happened, where they are able to control and manipulate the political process for their advantage. And unfortunately, they are few but very well organized. And the 22 million of us who are consumers, and the greatest benefit in the market system is the concept of a consumer surplus. Our consumer surplus is being taken away as a producer surplus, without any economic efficiency out of that process. So basically, this class of crony capitalists and rent seekers are postulating various solutions. But the reality is that if we have a system in which capitalism produces entrepreneurism, real risk taking, creativity, innovation, we will have a real bright Sri Lanka, which I am hopeful that will come forward if we have this great reset. But under a system in which cronism wants to promote its sustenance, because don't forget that in the post-COVID environment, our corporations have made record profits.
Yeah.
Record profits. Okay.
The share prices are going up.
So when
went
you
up for a while.
put controls, when you put bans, now for example, these recent bans, if you go through that list, it says L, 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 L.
License.
And L stands for license.
License.
So what they are saying is they are not saying that we are going to ban this, we are going to restrict it to a few. So that is a license to print money.
Yeah. Dr. Dunasinghe, I'd actually, as a current public official, being a university teacher, I suppose you qualify as a public official, as a public sector employee. I want to pose this question to you. In sort of preparing for this show and in reading about the economic crisis and the history of how we got here, we found that in 2009, I believe, when there was a letter of intent to the IMF in which the government had pledged to, curb military spending, stop the bloating of the public sector, promote competition in industry, etc., etc. And a committee was appointed back then as well, and you had individuals of the caliber of the late Dr. Kalegama, I think even the immediate past governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Professor Lakshman, was also on that committee, if I'm not mistaken. And they were supposed to, study and look into how we could restructure our public sector. And that report was never made public. And eventually, the Sri Lankan government, as it often does with its international agreements, reneged on its promises and didn't see through any of those pledges that it had made in that letter of intent. So we have a reputation now as the country that will always break our promises. As a serving public sector employee, how do you feel about the burden? I mean, you heard the finance minister say it last year as well during the budget speech, the burden that the public sector has become on the people of this country.
Yeah, I think it is quite clear that over and over again, politicians and other public officials mention that the size of the public sector is quite large in Sri Lanka, and this is largely because politicians themselves hired a lot to the public sector under, say, unemployed graduate scheme, or recently after this government came into power, they hired, I think, around 100,000 who are below the qualification of O-level, and again some number of undergraduates, so I mean the unemployed graduates. So the recruitments have been, I mean, done by the politician, and as a result it has become a burden.
It is a burden.
Yes, it is a burden, certainly. I think we all know that. I mean government, the politician and the public know that the size of the government is quite large and it is a burden, and but however the politician or the political parties are, you know, quite reluctant in addressing, at least curtailing, I mean stopping at least further hiring. Okay, now what the government did, they basically extended the retirement age. So quite opposite. Even now, even if you now get into the IMF agreement, one of the conditions, I am sure, to maybe to slow down or either stop hiring to the public sector, and maybe to offer some voluntary scheme for some of them to get out of the system, thereby reducing the size of the public sector.
Dr. Dunasinghe, are you a member of the Federation of University Teachers Association?
Yes.
As by virtue of being. I mean, this is the problem, isn't it? Whenever a government tries to, whenever a party that is in government tries to, you know, rein in state sector spending and, you know, seize recruitments and try to reduce the bloating of the public sector, it's the unions that tend to sabotage and jeopardize those processes, and that has been happening continuously years over years, so much so that governments don't even bother to make that commitment anymore, or even if they make that commitment, it's usually just lip service. Do you feel that at this point of time in the country, the unions can afford to continue acting in this way?
Yeah, definitely. In any country, that what we call the insiders resist for any kind of reforms, and there are certain incentive schemes proposed by the, you know, the market economy, proposing the market economy, so that with that you can simply reduce the number, and certainly the government can stop further recruitment as it happened in 2002 to 2004. I waited around 1.5 years after the interview to the university for this current recruitment, because government had a policy decision where the new recruitments are not done.
Right.
Dr. Dunasinghe, would you agree that...
Just give me a second, if you don't mind, please. We have some, the general public was joining us. Let's give them also an opportunity and pick their brains also with regard to what's going on in the country at the moment. We are now joined by Menaka Mayadunna. Menaka, are you there? Can you hear me? Menaka?
Yes, hi, I'm
right,
here.
Hi. Menaka, tell us a little bit about yourself in 1 or 2 lines, so we can pose a question to you as well with regard to how the country is moving forward.
Sure. So I'm employed at the moment. I hold the post of a manager.
Right.
And at the same time, I also have been an entrepreneur myself for the last 10 to 15 years.
Right. So
running
Menaka,
my own business.
Right. So Menaka,
Sure.
one of the suggestions that was given today by Dr. Anadas Bandaranaike was the fact that tightening the belts of the public should be communicated to the public and ensure that all of them are in the same page with regard to where the country is heading. As an employee of a private organization, you are working as a manager for a public entity, I presume, If that case be the scenario, can you afford to tighten your belts given the current cost of living experienced in the country at the moment?
To be very honest, Shehan, actually I can't, because at the moment I would find it very hard. I am finding it very hard actually, just to make ends meet from day to day. And I was following very closely what Dr. Anila was saying, and I agree with a lot of her points, but I do disagree with the point of, the point that was made by several of the eminent panelists, that there is there's a sector of Colombo, or the much richer crowd, to put it that way, who basically seem to be all right. But I take a lot of issue with that, because there is a generation of people like us, like me, right, who are never going to be at that level. And we are in a very, very tight spot in the middle, where we are unable to lift our head above water. We're unable to just make ends meet with, getting basic day-to-day groceries and so on and so forth. And when it comes down to a crunch or tightening of belts, so to speak, in larger companies, it will be mostly people like us who are let off in order to tighten belts. So in answer to your question, Shamir, I really would not, it would be a really serious problem for me if I was asked to tighten my belt anymore, because I wouldn't be able to breathe, to be honest.
Already we are in a dilemma, are we not? So, Dr. Anila, if you can respond to that.
May I just clarify, Menaka, when I said tighten belts, I didn't mean to tighten further. What I meant was what we are already going through.
Right.
We are tightening our belts because we are paying 300% more for gas. We can't even get the fuel. We are paying X% more for all our vegetables because the fuel is going to cost more. We will be paying more for electricity. It is happening.
Absolutely.
I'm not saying you tighten. I'm saying we have to accept that we have to go through this belt tightening process, because those in authority have self-inflicted this, not only on themselves, on us. We are in a belt tightening situation, and what I'm saying is we have to hold our breaths and go through this till things stabilize.
So, Lalit...
That's what I mean. Not to tighten any further. We can't.
We can't. There is no room.
I can, maybe there's no room to tighten, but we have to live through this tough time till it gets better.
So, Lalit...
Absolutely.
Lalit, you're joining us as well, I believe. Lalit Dasanayaka. Did I get your name right, Lalit? Lalit?
Yeah.
Right.
Can you hear me?
Right. So I can hear you. Lalit, again, in one or two lines, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself, so we know how to
Thanks,
pose
Shamir.
this question.
Thanks, Shamir, and thanks for MTV and Face the Nation program for giving me this opportunity to join the discussion. Yeah, I'm an international consultant, independent consultant, working on international development and environment. So I got involved in some of the vigils, basically to kind of voice on behalf of the poor masses out there suffering.
So Lalit, when you were engaged in these vigils, I know one of the past SEMA presidents were also engaged in one of the vigils last Sunday, and the sentiments that everyone is expressing is very unique. They want the present president to go home. That's what most of them are saying. What is your sentiment?
Yes, I think, Shamir, it's pretty obvious that after 2 years, the president and his team has failed miserably, the nation and the people. And my concern on behalf of the suffering masses is just that how the government led by him is so oblivious to the suffering people, and they're not concerned. To me, an immediate and urgent relief measure would be, at least in the short term, would be to some sort of financial subsidy. But then again, let alone the dollar crisis, I think the country is facing a severe rupee crisis. So my obvious question here is to be able to provide some sort of financial relief. What has happened to the billions and trillions of rupees printed in the past few months.
Right. So,
So-
Lalit, let me stop you there and pose that question to Murtaza, if you don't mind, please, because Murtaza is an expert in this field, so it's better to pick Murtaza's brain. So, are we in a rupee crisis, Murtaza, at the moment?
So, you know, the rupees are basically there in bank accounts. I mean, when you talk about broad money supply, you basically aggregate all the rupee deposits in the banking system, and that has increased by 40%. So when Lalit says that there's a shortage of rupees, there is certainly a shortage of rupees with the Ceylon Electricity Board because they are not paying their bills. There is a shortage of rupees in the treasury because they are not collecting enough tax revenue. There's a shortage of rupees in the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation. But households, the richer households in Sri Lanka have seen their rupee balances significantly expand.
So, Murtaza, what is the stability of the local banking system in Sri Lanka at the moment, given the current dilemma that we are facing? What about the stress on the depositors that all this is emanating or, affecting at the end of the day?
Okay, so in the interest of time, let me just give you a broad way to how to think about it. There are 3 points of stress that the current financial system is going to go through. Most of the banks are sitting on dollar sovereign bonds. So these are what we call ISBs, international sovereign bonds, or better known as Euro bonds. They also have a locally issued dollar instrument called Sri Lanka Development Bonds. A large maturity happened a few days ago, which was paid. And they're sitting on a large loan book which has been lent out to the economy, of which a small proportion of it was in moratorium under COVID. And the moratoriums have been reduced, but still some of the banks are sitting on fair amount of moratoriums. Now the issue is, Shamir, the longer this financial crisis continues, even sound companies might start going bad. And that is why we are in such a dangerous situation that we have to take action immediately, because you might have an issue that we have a sovereign debt crisis, we have a balance of payment crisis, but we don't want a banking crisis. And we have to
That's the last thing we want. That's the last thing we want.
I mean, normally the three can go together. It has happened, and we don't have the fiscal space to recapitalize our banks.
Would there be a time, Murtaza, where the banks would tell the people of Sri Lanka, I'm very sorry, I don't have the money to give you? Because that's happening in countries like Iraq and Libya.
So the question is, I mean, that is quite literally a bank run, and what happens is that you limit the amount of deposits that can be withdrawn at any one given time. The question is that I hope that sanity prevails and that we don't get there, but if we don't take the remedial action now, one cannot rule that out.
Sanity prevails. There's a long tall order.
Yes, we hope. We hope. I mean, we always live in hope, no, Shami?
Professor Pires, I'd like to pose this question to you. Now, in his address to the nation, in his brief address to the nation, his third one was I think shorter than both the others, was barely made it to a third of both his previous addresses. But in his brief address to the nation, the president identified several inflows of foreign exchange that would be coming into the country. He said projected inflows, billions upon billions of dollars. Still a deficit, but we're going to get more and more. I think he was talking about $25 billion in other grants and investments. He didn't specify what these were. About $12 billion in export, so on and so forth. Are these projections realistic?
So what I would say is that if you look at what's happened in Sri Lanka in the last 2-3 years, it's very similar, unfortunately, to what's happened in many other countries, especially if you look at the way the government has responded. So if you take, for example, the Greek crisis, where there was more or less $500 billion of debt, which was ultimately extended by the Troika, IMF, ECB, and European Council, plus there was a 50% haircut on the debt. Now, in the early days of this crisis, so I have very close collaborators, co-authors who were advisors to two of the prime ministers at that time. And essentially the view coming out of the cabinet there was that we can work it out. This is something temporary, we just need to fight through until the next month, the next month, the next month, and things will be okay. And then there was suddenly a big payment to be made, the US interest rates rose, and they got to a position where they were basically scrambling around. And at that point, they were in a lot of trouble because they were, I think, similar to kind of the mood here, very anti-IMF. So the IMF traditionally has these negative connotations that they're going to come in, they're going to impose taxes, they're going to fire people, and you have to take this. And because of this, governments don't want to go to the IMF. And so in the Greek sort of debt crisis history, the only reason the IMF came in was because the Germans said that, Angela Merkel actually stepped in and said that we need to have the IMF, otherwise we're not participating. So, the views the Sri Lankan president has made, what's been coming out of the central bank, the finance ministry, is also consistent with this logic. And if you look at even other countries, it's the same sort of idea. It's not even denial, it's the hope, the perverse hope maybe, but the hope that we can work it out if we wait long enough.
So basically they're living in fairy tale land.
Well, anything is possible. Somebody can come in with 25 billion and then maybe problems are okay.
Udara, you make a lot of sense now. You are also a member of the Research Advisory Board of the Central Bank of Russia, am I correct?
Yes.
Right. So now we speak about the Greek crisis. Now we had a governor of the central bank, who did not predict that 2012 is going to be a difficult year for Greece.
If I just may point something out there, Sri Lanka's current credit ratings, junk status, is actually lower than the Greek bonds that we bought that the central bank invested in.
So now we had a governor who miscalculated the entire bond in Greece. Now we have the same governor sitting in the Central Bank of Sri Lanka and trying to tell the people as to how things should govern. Don't you think this is a problem? Isn't this a problem? Isn't this an issue?
I mean, what I would say is that, as an economist, as an analyst, I would take a broader picture. That what is coming out is consistent with the idea that when countries get into these issues with sovereign debt, the biggest problem for the incumbent government is political. And if you take the general kind of political group that's in charge, they have two choices: to default and things will be bad, or to repay and things will be bad.
Let me rephrase that question to you again, Udara.
Yeah.
When we had a governor who could not calculate that Greece is going to fall, we had the same governor telling us not to go to the IMF. How do you view that? I'm rephrasing my question now.
I think it's probably consistent with his worldview that, he had a relationship with...
He's taking all of us in the same abyss he is going.
Yes. Yes.
Great. That's what we want.
To be fair, we should also mention that I think in 2014 the Supreme Court cleared the central bank and the governor of any wrongdoing in the case of the Greek bonds.
No. It's at the end of the day. It's at the end of the day.
There's an issue of
you cannot establish intent, Nadine. You cannot establish intent.
Well, what I would say though, just to step in, just focusing on individuals is really, I think, not the right way for us as public to think. It's really an institution.
At this moment, the problem
it is an issue, yes.
It's sending negative signals, amber signals to investors. Whoever wants to come to Sri Lanka, Udara, won't come to Sri Lanka because they think that the IMF is not engaged, because the central bank governor is saying something else, the president is saying something else, the prime minister is saying something else, the minister of finance is saying something else. It seems that all of them are in different cabinets, in different worlds.
That is going to be the thing that the country really has to sort out.
So whether it's individuals or not, it's the future of this country.
Yeah.
Right.
I've got a question here which has been sent to me by one of our viewers. I'll just put it to you, Udara or Dr. Anila. We need to ask the advisory committee, if they had a failing CEO, would they think getting him or her an advisory committee that comes with a 5-step plan as the solution?
Want to take it first, and then you go first.
Sorry, so
Would you like to repeat it?
Yeah, please.
You want to tell us the...
Neither of us understood the question.
I think if any of the business persons on the advisory committee in their companies, if they had a CEO who was failing, would they then would they then appoint an advisory committee to that CEO, or would they basically change the CEO?
I mean, so the situation of multiple committees for committees is obviously absurd. And I think it's especially absurd because what Sri Lanka is going through has been seen across the world in many places. It's the same story that's been played out. It's a combination of a current account crisis and a fiscal crisis, and hopefully, as Murtaza said, not a banking crisis. So the solutions to this are also well known. There are plenty, lots and lots of reports written by the IMF, by the ECB, by lots of different organizations, by expert economists. You can just take this and you can see what's to do. That you don't need a committee to reinvent the wheel. And in fact, it's not good to use experts, domestic experts, for this. That's exactly why you get the IMF, and you get in people who have seen these episodes in multiple countries, and you ask them, what do we do? And then based on this, we work out a plan.
Dr. Dara, you said earlier that we shouldn't be focusing on individuals. But in Sri Lanka, although we are supposedly a democratic country, it has always been big man politics. You do have to, unfortunately or otherwise, focus on that. And that is why, for example, the expectation that the current Minister of Finance would come in with 7 brains and solve the problem, that's why there was so much of expectation. So don't you think that if the President says that, look, I'm not to blame, but somebody has to carry the can, and if he doesn't want to, do you think it's a good idea to change the Minister of Finance, or is that also not part of the system?
No, the system is that ultimately the person at the top takes responsibility, and this is a serious enough issue in the country where the President has to take responsibility.
And that is what our protesters, the people who are doing these vigils, are in effect saying, that they feel put out, that mismanagement is the cause of all what's going on.
And in fact, I think if he does take responsibility, we can move forward, because with that responsibility, there can be clear decisions and united set of decisions among the different agencies and ministries of the government.
So, Faraj, because you mentioned about the general public who are joining us tonight on Face the Nation, I want to drag my attention to Dr. Ruwan Veerasinghe. Dr. Ruwan, are you there?
Yes, Samir, I'm here.
Right, super. So, Dr. Ruwan, let's, if you can give a quick introduction about yourself, that would be great. Just a 2-liner would be sufficient.
I teach in a university, and I've been actually in the last 3 weeks joining these, well, basically supporting these young people who are really saying that, they are here not because of, their personal futures only, but because of the so many people who are suffering out there. So I really admire that in them.
So Dr. Ruwan, today I met a few individuals before I came to host Face the Nation. And when I met one of them, they said they're looking to migrate because they don't see any hope in Sri Lanka anymore. And unfortunately, the VFS officers in Colombo do not give appointments because of the exodus number of appointments, interviews that they have already handed out. So what is your message to the young population in Sri Lanka? You're also universities, just like Dr. Priyanka Dunsingha. So if that case is the point that we're talking about, what is the message you have for the young people of Sri Lanka? Must they leave the country? Is it all done and dusted? No more hope? Nothing? No glimmer of hope? Absolutely none? What is your take?
I think it's a hard question, and it's something that we have to be attentive to. And yet, in this group that I've seen, there was someone, I think you may have seen some of those clips on the first day, someone who came and said, why should we go? They should. And by they meant the politicians. They should go. We shouldn't go. We should stay here and rebuild this country. And so that's
But don't you
the
think?
main thing.
But don't you think, Dr. Ruwan, that the people also have a responsibility here, because they get a chance to appoint politicians to the legislature or the head of the state every 5 to 6 years. And don't you think they should be held accountable as well? Because we are in this mess today because of the fact that people went and voted this government to power.
Exactly. But the main problem is that we think that we come once in 5 years, exactly what you said, and then we just sit back and let them do, it's a free ticket for the next 5 years. And what this protest is showing is that that's not the case. So now we are not going to be satisfied with that. We want to make sure that people come out there and hold the governments responsible in between those elections.
Right. So we are also joined by Trehan Munasinghe. Trehan, are you there? Trehan?
Yes, Shamir. Thank you very much.
Super. So Trehan,
having us.
same drill. If you can give us a brief introduction about yourself, just a two-liner would be sufficient.
Yes, I'm mainly from an HR background. I'm also into real estate advisory.
Right.
But my main area is recruitment, so I do meet a lot of people when it comes to HR work.
So Trehan, now I don't know whether you were privy to this information, but you saw in social media doing the rounds the young parliamentarian and the Minister of Sports in Maldives trying to promote Maldivian tourism when the country is in dire straits at the moment. And what is your take? If you have to give a message to these politicians who are enjoying their time while the people are suffering, while the people have died in queues, what is the message you have for them?
Bit of a tough spot that you have put me in, but let me put it this way. This is definitely not the time to be having facades or any type of showmanship or anything like that. I mean, yes, if you're going overseas for the benefit of the country to enhance tourism, so be it. But I guess taking recordings like that, putting it on social media, I think people of the person that you're mentioning, or even anybody for that matter, even civil society, they need to cut back a lot, because this is not a time to be putting on shows. Yes, you need to bring in revenue for the country. You need to bring in new avenues. Look at other possibilities of enhancing our tourism, because that took a big hit from 2019 onwards.
Trehan, little does the Minister of Sports realize if he wants to promote tourism in Sri Lanka, he should do whatever he was doing in Maldives in the country, not in Maldives. He's promoting tourism in the Maldives, not in Sri Lanka.
Very true.
Anyway, Menaka has a question for us. Yes, Menaka, you are with us. Menaka Mayaduna, you have a question for one of the panelists, Menaka.
Yes, so actually...
We can hear you, Menaka, yes. What's the audio? Menaka, we just lost the audio. Right.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. We can hear you now.
Oh, excellent.
Right.
Sorry about that.
Right.
So I just wanted to elaborate or pick up on Shamir's point earlier, the point that you made about the central bank governor, showing his inability to predict the Greek bond situation and, putting that same person in charge now. And Udara's point on it as well. And now actually Ruwan Veerasinghe also went on to explain a little more in detail about the people holding this group of governors accountable, right? I don't think, at least what we would like to kind of point out, or I would like to point out, is one of the reasons that I have also joined in supporting the vigils, right? It's that we have continuously had the same set of unqualified people trying to run the country for the last, I think, 25, 30 years, the same set of faces going around and around, almost like musical chairs, pardon my language, but, and it hasn't been working, right? And I think that is one of the main reasons that we have gotten out on the street and we're saying enough is enough and we need to hold them accountable. But I would also like to sort of ask, because Dr. Anila also made this point earlier, that accountability is key, right? How would you sort of suggest that we take some real tangible steps to enforcing accountability for anyone in a publicly elected office? Because I think accountability is something that is sorely lacking right now.
So with your permission, Menaka, I'm going to pose that question to all four panelists. So let's start off with Murtaza. Accountability, it should lie somewhere. Where must it lie at the end of the day?
So obviously, I mean, the accountability mechanisms, first there is an element of accountability at the institutional level, but finally it has to come to the governance level in the country. And we, through the political process, we selected a number of legislators, and ours is the executive system. So finally, the executive leader in the country is where the buck should stop.
Not him saying that this is not a crisis that is caused by me.
Well, my sense is, I'll elaborate on that later, Shamir. There are also global factors at play, but certainly I think he could have picked better economic advisors.
Right. Dr. Ananda?
Yeah. I think this will need another Face the Nation program, but I actually think that the current system with the executive, the legislature and the judiciary, the way it is now, will never work. Partly because of the PR system, because even at the legislature level, if you look at the way politicians are appointed, they are at the district level. There is no more. I think we need a different system of a combination of electorates and PR representation, so that any individual can hold their elected representative accountable in a small area. I think the system doesn't work now, so that has to change, but it will never happen because no parliament will seriously look at it. I think there's at the moment a constitutional committee, right? And even we were called as...
Dr. Anand, just to connect that proposal on electoral reform to what Murtaza was saying earlier about state capture by these robber barons or crony capitalists, is that at the end of the day, no matter how you change the electoral system, if you don't have political finance disclosure, that the public is not aware of who's funding these politicians, then they will continue, whether you're first past the post, mixed member proportional or PR, they will continue to act in the interests of these people.
I don't think, you're absolutely right, but I don't think we'll ever get to that level of sophistication. But I totally agree with Murtaza that, in fact, I mean, I'll be very honest, in the past few months, everything too little, too late, I was asked by various groups, private sector, to sign certain letters going to the president, going to the finance minister, and I refused because, the amount of sugar coating that was going on. Somebody sent me one which said something about the roadmap. I said, I can't sign this. This is a lie. Then I asked the person, do you believe there was any sense in this roadmap? I said, it's utter rubbish to me, sorry for the language. And that person, a very senior person in the private sector, said, yes, it's rubbish. I said, why are you putting this sentence? Why are you sugarcoating what you have to tell them? So the private sector, I'm always told I'm not a business person. Private sector has also been soft peddling for far too long. And as Murtaza said, if you have captured, the captured people change from government to government.
The captured lot is in the Economic Council as well, advising the president.
I'm not saying that, but I don't think businessmen should be on Economic Advisory Council.
But I mean,
so
even if you look
really
at the chambers,
and unless, and again, I will respond to Mrs. Mayadunne by saying that finally we are accountable, we people, because unless the culture changes, unless the value system changes, unless you start this from the children, it's not going to change. These problems are there around the world. In our case, we are now in a true crisis. And again, the accountability. I agree with Udara, you cannot talk about individuals. But if the system says that these are the responsibilities of a senior person in government, and if they have not discharged their responsibilities, they have to be asked to leave. If they had any sense, if they had any sense of response, if they had any ethics or integrity, they would step down.
So, as Menaka says,
So,
every year
yeah.
the pack is shuffled, Dr. Anil.
Yes.
But the jokers
So then-
remain.
But then
But the jokers remain.
my response to Menaka would be, then the leadership has to come from the young people. And I would like to add one more thing.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know whether everybody, people saw it. There was, you know, a group of politicians got together. Some people initiated to get parliamentarians from all the parties, including government, to look at this debt issue and suggest a restructuring program, which said exactly what Udara was saying. If you're doing restructuring, you can't go to each one individually, you have to call them all together. All that was in an open letter that was signed by some of the people present at the meeting and others supported. But I think it fell on deaf ears.
Right. So, Udara, just
problems
moving away from the topic at hand with regard to accountability and all that and more, I just want to focus your attention on the all-party meeting that is scheduled for next Wednesday, which was convened by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. Now, many political parties have already said that they will not be attending the all-party political conference in question. The question that is being posed by one of our viewers is the fact that whether all political parties will be willing to sign off an eventual IMF prescription, thus effectively precluding politics being played with the prescription.
So, I mean, I refer back to Greece again. In the space of 5 years, there were 7 governments that were formed. Now, I understand here there's like limits to where the government change, but that gives some idea of the political turmoil that's to be expected, whichever path it's been taken. So in that sense, I don't think it's necessary to have an agreement with all the parties. I think what's important is that the current executive takes this responsibility as if it was a time of war. I mean, if the country was under attack, they wouldn't blame the defense minister, the commerce minister, whatever. The president would be at the one that would be leading the discussion and taking this as priority number one. And it's hard for me to understand why the current situation is not seen at this level. People are literally starving on the streets.
But maybe it's because they're the ones that are attacking the country. The country is under attack from them.
I would be a little bit more charitable. I think it's a misunderstanding and misreading of the situation. And I think, once people's hunger in their stomachs spills out to the streets, then it will be too late for the executive to respond. And that's why it's really up to everybody to really get the executive to take responsibility and to take leadership. And I'm sure whatever decision is made is going to have negative consequences and it will cause a problem. But there needs to be some step forward, and it can't be this discussion that we had a chat with the IMF, now we'll have a longer chat with the IMF. These things really need to be done very cleanly.
Dr. Dunasinghe, for us, very quickly, just one question for Dr. Dunasinghe and then it's all yours. Dr. Dunasinghe, now, you heard President Gotabaya Rajapaksa saying that I entered politics on your invitation. Now, little does the president realize that the public didn't invite him. It was the SLPP, the Sri Lanka Pojjara Peramuna, led by President Mahinda Rajapaksa, who invited President Gotabaya Rajapaksa to enter politics. Now, there is a huge cry in the country with regard to him going home. Does that mean that he will now go home?
I think what we need to look at this moment, whether now in the short run, whether his going home can solve the issue. If we get into a political crisis at this moment of time, I don't think that it will be a conducive to address the current issue.
So
I think the best thing is...
Are you trying to say, Dr. Dunasinghe, that there is no one right now to lead the country? Is that what you're trying to say? Because we saw the SJB launching a protest campaign several days ago. We see the NPP trying to come forward with their own proposals for a better country, a unified nation, so on and so forth. Are you trying to say that even these two political parties are not the alternative for the future of this country?
No. At the moment, as I see, people do not see a leader who they could trust. As a result, they in a scattered manner do go on protest and all, and this is very serious. Now, unless we understand the frustration, in particular the middle class and the lower low income groups, we will get into a much bigger crisis when we go ahead with the IMF. So I think it is very important to not to get into a bigger political crisis at this moment. If we get into that, it will be a disaster.
You also sound, Dr. Dhunsu, you sound like Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe. But he said the same thing.
No, exactly. We need to.
He wants to hang on to his parliamentary seat.
No, I think we should not look at it that way.
MP. Can we get this right? How much more of a crisis do we need? We've got farmers who've got some blessed nano fertilizer or something. The plants, have you seen it? It's about this big. Instead, it should be this big. The brinjals are less than the size of a cricket ball. And you are saying that we've got no other... Whose idea was it? To go into the whole world has got less than 10% of organic produce. And Sri Lanka, this tiny little country, led by one family, think that they can do it to go 100% organic? They've ruined the tea industry, they've ruined the paddy harvests, and we're now having to import rice from outside, which is, by the way, not organic.
Right.
And how much more? And the question is, how close are we to Lebanon, or are we beyond Lebanon?
I think very much closer to the Lebanon.
So below or...
I agree. I think that we are saying how much further. I think we have to stop food riots. When people can't feed their children, they will go out and try get the food they can. We have to stop that. But there's one other point, you know. I agree with what was said just now, because you don't want a political crisis on top of this and no clear leadership coming out. And the other thing that one recognizes when one looks at our whole political system is that these different parties, I don't know any party that is really looking at the country. They are only looking at coming back into power.
Yes.
And each, you know, at this point there's a national crisis. They have to work together.
But they've all said that they're not going to attend the all-party conference.
But then they must recognize that the ones in power don't know what they're doing. I mean, sorry to say, they are just clueless.
But isn't it a political tug of war that is taking place in Sri Lanka at the moment?
But people have to, I mean, if you really care for the country, you have to rise above that at this point in time. What he says, you cannot have another political crisis. Supposing tomorrow a plane comes from Uganda and the Rajapaksas all jump on it and take their governor and whoever is with it, what will happen?
With the all-party representative conferences, there was an interesting take that I saw someone had posted on Twitter. It's like,
I think
there is an all-party representative committee. It's called the Parliament. Unfortunately, the finance minister doesn't believe that he should be attending Parliament. And that was the take on this all-party committee that the president has convened. So, I mean, you do sort of see it from the perspective of the opposition parties as well, whether it's the SJB, the JVP, or right now even the CWC has said they're not attending. I mean, you've got a government with a two-thirds majority in parliament that has all the power to take the steps that it needs. It has all the power to take the steps that it needs to take, or whatever is prescribed for it to take. But instead we see this kind of pussyfooting around the issues, around this blame game. Oh, this is not a crisis of my making. Oh, this was these guys, the people that are now criticizing me are the ones that brought this about. I mean, why has this government been vested with the power to act if their response is Economic Advisory Council for the Economic Advisory Council. There is a parliament, but we're also going to have an all-party representative committee to advise the parliament on what it should do.
But don't we also have to ask, if this government is doing so badly and there's nobody, maybe the 200 advisors think they are doing well, but if there's nobody who thinks that they are going in the right direction, then surely the rest of Parliament must be able to do something about this.
A no confidence motion.
Something. They must work together to do something about this.
No, can I ask this question from Mr. Jafferji, please? It's rather relevant. Mr. Jafferji, we're sort of close to Lebanon, or just above, just below, who knows? What should small businesses do to mitigate their risk? Should, during this volatile situation, should they keep cash in a bank, invest in real estate, or in inventory?
So for us, until basically, as I said, that this system that has prevailed in the last 2 years has been highly beneficial for big business. First of all, with all the restrictions that we imposed on the foreign exchange market, it was the larger businesses that got priority access to foreign exchange, because simply the banks took the view that I will allocate whatever limited resource we have depending on the business relationship that I have, and invariably it's the larger businesses that got access to the precious foreign exchange in the country. We also saw the level of contestability in the market came down significantly. So the small traders and the small importers, they were quite literally wiped out, and the larger companies basically gained share and gained greater pricing power. So now your question is what the small businesses should do now. Now that we are in the early stages of a free floating exchange rate, that disadvantage that they were faced with in the last 2 years has now hopefully going to go away. The second thing is that they are far more nimble, right? So it's not the size that is going to matter, but the people who are nimble. So even in an economic crisis, the consumer doesn't go away. It's just that they have to allocate their consumption from what they are normally consuming to things that they can afford to consume. And that is where the smaller businesses who are more nimble and innovative have an opportunity to play, because the larger companies have more inertia and they are not going to be able to move that fast in meeting customers' needs. As far as what should they do with their money, I mean, in all fairness, interest rates have now been liberalized and they are rapidly going up. So the 10-year bond has gone over 15%. Okay, interest rate, I mean, inflation is quite high, but 15% over 10 years is a fairly good investment. It's the problem is the deposits, etc., in the banks are not repricing. It will probably take 3 to 6 months for it to fully reprice. So now fixed income is not a bad asset class, and real estate has been the killer asset class ever since the end of the conflict from 2010 to about 2022. If you look at even the central bank index of Colombo district land prices, it has outpaced every other asset class. But generally there is a relationship between land prices and interest rates, and when interest rates go up to these levels, generally I would think the outlook for real estate is going to be sober.
Right. So we have some questions from the general public who are joining us this evening on Face the Nation. It's the first time that we're having the general public joining us via Zoom on Face the Nation, and it's all happening tonight on the show. Angelo De Silva, Trehan Minusingha, Ruwan Veerasinghe, as well as Menaka Mayadunna, Lalit Disanayak, all joining us tonight on Face the Nation. I think Angelo, Trehan, and Ruwan have questions from the panelists. If you can pose your questions, then we will momentarily direct them to the panelists accordingly. So, Angelo, let's start off from you.
Thank you. So it's a quick question on behalf of the many. I wanted to ask, how much is 100 rupees earned in 2019 worth today? How does one look at that in a very simple point of view to understand the value of money today, that they've, in comparison to what they have been making in the pre-pandemic time, which was the last time we kind of had some normalcy back in 2019.
Right. Trehan? Trehan, I assume you also have a question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, my question is more to do with the youth. Now, as you know, the quality of life in Sri Lanka has been a question mark for many years, maybe even decades, right? So now we are in 2022. So my question would be to the panel, how are we going to get the youth, especially those who are in the early 20s till about, say, maybe 35, to stay in Sri Lanka? That's one. Because we know that the inflation rate is now at 15%, food inflation is at 25%, it was mentioned today on the show. One of the greatest battles, one of the greatest problems that I face as a recruiter is asking these youngsters, or even sometimes even those who are older than me, what are the things that you all really look for in a job? And they're simple things, to look after my family, to look after my partner, to buy a car, to build a home. These are simple things that, most of their peers or their colleagues are able to do overseas in a very short period of time. So what can we as recruiters and people in HR tell, what are we to tell new candidates or even prospective employees?
Right. So let me first pose the question to Dr. Anila and also Professor Udara. How much is 100 rupees worth in today's context?
What was the inflation? How much has it risen by?
Cumulatively, maybe about 22% up to now, probably heading up over the 2 years.
Only 22 for the last 2 years?
2 years,
No,
yes.
okay.
15 plus about 6 or 7 previously.
Okay. Right.
So you can
So about
explain to him the
70,
real
80.
value
Yeah.
and the limitations
Look
about
at
the inflation
otherwise,
measurement also.
Take a cup of tea.
Yeah.
Please.
So actually,
Yeah.
if I can just pitch in that there are
I
few
think
ways that you
100.
can look at it. So what he's asking is
60,
his
I
100
got.
rupees,
Yeah.
how do you preserve the real value of his 100 rupees?
Probably
And the first
60,
problem
I'd say
that you're
60.
going to do is that, how you're going to measure the real value, which basket that you're going to use. So there is something called the Colombo Consumer Price Index and the National Consumer Price Index. And at the moment, these two indices on an annual basis are running at about 15 to 16%. And if you look at the previous year, it would have been running at about 6 to 7%. So you put the two together, there's a compounding effect, maybe about 24%. So if he's asking, it's about the 100. Advocate basically that I represent has something called a bath curry index. So it is specifically only for a bath packet. And I'm afraid that I can't remember what the figure would have been over 2 years. But then that is only focused on food. And Shamir, food inflation is running extremely high.
24%.
If total inflation was running at 15%, food inflation running at 25%. So the question is that 100 rupees is going to, in real purchasing power, going to be worth a lot less. But the extent of it depends on the type of inflation indicator that you're going to use. For rich people, it will mean very different to poor people.
Right. So, Udara, with regard
Maybe
to the
50.
second question that was posed by Trehan, how do you get people to stay in Sri Lanka? Now, you know the Russian context right now, what is happening. A lot of people are leaving Russia as well with the looming of the war. So in a country like Russia, I don't want you to make comparison with Russia to Sri Lanka, but you have that experience, what's happening in Russia. Given that fact, how do you think, what must the government do in order to make sure that there is no brain drain and people do not migrate to other countries?
So let me just answer first the direct question of what you tell the young people. So what I would say, the simple answer is that because people are leaving, salaries are going up. And so if you stay, your salaries here, the wages you would get would be higher, just because there's less supply and the demand will be the same. But beyond that, there's not really much more to say. But I think this argument itself is going to be sufficiently strong. Depending on the area, if there's a large brain drain, your salaries will go up, which is not good for the economy, but for the individuals, it will be good. Now, what does the government do in this situation? It's very difficult because, if you take, typically default episodes take 5 years to resolve, maybe 3 if you're lucky, but in general 3 to 5. And for a young person who's 21, 22, this is a big chunk of their youth. and to ask them to stay in the country where they can go overseas, they can develop skills, expertise. The question is, what can you offer here? And I think the best thing that the government can do is to give a clear path for the resolution of this. Because I say 3 to 5 years is a good resolution. There are countries like Belize which have been defaulting serially for 20 years. And my fear is that the current way that the discussion is going from the top, it will be 20 years, there will be 3, 4 defaults. And that's a whole generation whose future is wasted. And that's why I said that the president should be taking this as if it was a case for war. It was a time of war. And that's a seriousness with which this needs to be resolved. Or given if he has an answer he knows to say what this is and give people something which they can plan around.
Right. So I want to thank Angelo De Silva, Dr. Ruwan Veerasinghe, Lalit Disanayake, Trehan Munasinghe, and also Menaka Mayadunna from the general public joining us this evening on Face the Nation tonight. Unfortunately, because we are wrapping up the show in a bit, we would like to thank the 5 of you for joining us, 5 of you for joining us tonight on Face the Nation. Thank you very much for your thoughts, inputs, as well as the good work that you're doing right now in the country. I want to pose a question to Professor Udara with regard to debt restructuring. So now, we are all aware, Professor, that each sovereign debt restructuring is unique to each country. What is the best fit model for Sri Lanka?
So with Sri Lanka, it's got, what's unique to it is the large amount of bilateral loans and multilateral. In terms of what is left, a big chunk of this, as Murtaza mentioned, and I can't find statistics on this, it's the amount of sovereign external dollar debt which is held by the domestic banking system. So if you take realistically where you can get a big chunk of a haircut, it's with the private foreign investors. And so now that means the amount of haircut you can get directly right now is very limited. However, the bilateral partners, the friends that have lent lots, they should be willing to restructure the loans, delay the maturity, reduce the interest payments, but all this has to happen transparently. It has to be a case where we say, okay, China, the US, India, whoever's lent most, they're going to get the same terms. And we're open to everybody that they get the same terms because that's the weight they have in our portfolio. There has to be a clear logic to this. And so the prerequisite for all of this is what's called a creditor committee. And the creditor committee is something which represents the private bondholders, but together with this, you bring the sovereigns, the multilaterals, and all of this is essentially spearheaded by the IMF. And I said the IMF's role is 2 parts. One is to help us to work through this process and work out what fiscal reforms to make, and second, to bring credibility to this process.
So there's also talk about a collective action clause, or CAC, Udara. What does this mean?
So the collective action clause is usually written into the debt contracts when they're issued, which means that the government can trigger certain things, like to say that if certain bondholders don't agree to renegotiation terms, they don't get their money back. So this is like terms which the government can use to force the bondholders into agreement. Now,
yeah.
With
so,
Sri
Udara,
Lanka,
does that necessarily mean that we will have debt sustainability going forward?
Debt sustainability comes from, one, cutting the stock of debt significantly and in present value terms. So this doesn't mean that tomorrow we tell China we're only paying half of your debt. No, it just means that we'll pay your debt not in 10 years, but in 20 years, 30 years. The second thing is the fiscal reforms. And as some of our guests have said, tightening people's belts is very difficult. But the alternative is 20 years of going through these episodes with inflation. Murtaza mentioned inflation is 20%. I mean, in the last 2 weeks, I've seen prices of taxis go up 10, 20%. I mean, for me, I've seen inflation much higher in 2 weeks. Okay, so we're looking at already extremely high rates of inflation for this year. And this is a tax. So I want the audience to really understand that inflation is a tax by the government on people's assets. And the assets are deposits.
So, Udara makes a lot of sense with regard to inflation and taxation, which is an indirect tax at the end of the day, Murtaza. What are your thoughts on this?
So
What's the question again, Shamir?
So Udar is of the opinion that the inflation itself is taxation. It's coming as an indirect tax. We ultimately have to pay it, and this is a tax. We are ultimately on the other side of the coin, so we have to pay it at the end of the day. What are your thoughts on this?
So the thing is that there are different types of taxation, and typically you want to tax the rich people, basically the people with the highest levels of income. So we know from certain national income statistics that the top 20% of households generate 50% of the income, and the top 10% of the households generate 35% of the income. Now somebody asked me once a question, how much does the top 1% of households generate? I don't have that figure, but my guesstimate is probably 20%. So in an ideal tax system, in a progressive tax system, you want the rich households basically to pay the bulk of your taxes, and that would be a progressive system. Now unfortunately in our taxation system, the direct taxation only accounts for less than 20%, while 80% of the taxation is through consumption taxes, and it's considered regressive because the rich households would save much more. They will not consume a similar proportion of their income than the poorer households. Now what Udara talked about, the inflation tax, the problem with the inflation tax is it's very regressive in nature. It does not tax the rich people, because the rich people are sophisticated enough to be able to hold non-monetary assets. Inflation taxes monetary assets. So they are more sophisticated, and they have other assets like property and real assets like gold and precious stones and equities that the poor people don't have. So the worst type of taxation that you can have is inflation tax, which again creates macroeconomic instability. It doesn't create economic efficiency. Companies find it difficult to control their prices. Everybody holds back. Nobody is willing to commit for long-term investment. And the whole cycle is a vicious cycle, a race to the bottom.
So Udara, interestingly, we are now talking about the IMF. We are talking a little bit about debt restructuring, all that and more. But little do we talk about the Paris Club. Is there any opportunity for Sri Lanka to go to the Paris Club? We know there are many countries in the club: Australia, Austria, Belgium, Brazil, Canada, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Ireland, India, Israel, Italy, Japan, Netherlands, Norway, Russia, South Korea, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, United Kingdom, United States, out of which India and Japan, which are also predominant lenders to Sri Lanka, are in this club. And since 1956, they have signed 433 agreements with 90 different countries, covering over US dollars 583 billion US dollars. Why isn't the government looking at this option as well?
So the issue is that I think China is not in the Paris Club. So again, you can't do an agreement, you can't get an agreement for the Paris Club members to accept a haircut when another big chunk of the bondholders are not agreeing to this. So it's purely the idea that we're not trying to cheat our lenders. We're being very honest to them and saying, look, we have people that can't afford food. Now, either we don't pay you and get them food, or we let them starve and we pay you. And we can't do this. And so once we start from this position, then it's a sequence of steps to come to an agreement of what we can actually realistically pay so our people don't starve. And that's the transparency that needs to happen, and that has come from a very clear direction coming from the top, that this is what we're going to do.
So, Dr.
Shamir, if I can jump in, because there's a very important point Udara made. In fact, my understanding is India is also not a member of the Paris Club. They're an associate member. Yeah. But I want to explain the concept of subordination. Right? So what has happened is that the moment we lost our rating somewhere during about September of 2020, as Lee Bouquet, who is one of the world experts on debt restructuring, explained that most countries don't borrow expecting to pay it back. They expect to borrow again to repay. The moment we lost our rating, our access to the market was gone. At that time, our debt was unsustainable. There was no way we were going to roll it over. Now what happened is that we did have reserves at that time, about 6 to 7 billion. Now we kept using the reserves and we did import compression, we did collect some dollars from the market, but we kept on paying the debt. So what we did is we paid the early debt, the debt that was coming due in the near term. Now what has happened is that when this crisis we got downgraded, our bond instruments were trading at 70 cents to the dollar. Today they are trading at 48 cents to the dollar. And this is an illustration of the subordination problem, because those bondholders and the latter creditors know, because these people were given a get out of jail card, I am going to take a bigger hit.
So Murtaza, does that mean that we do not now have access to international markets?
We lost access somewhere towards the end of 2020 when our rating was cut to CCC. Then it was further cut to CC. So what we have gone and done is that if at that moment we had restructured, the pain could have been distributed over a larger base. Now what is happening is that the redistribution of the pain is over a smaller base, and therefore they have to take a large haircut. And what is going to happen, Shamir, is when we get into restructuring negotiations, they are going to push back and say, you knew you couldn't pay us back, why did you allow those other guys to get away with 100% payment and you are expecting us to take a huge haircut?
But still there are people, who don't understand. They say, oh, if we restructure, don't pay our debt, we will not be able to borrow. But we have already lost our ability to borrow. We cannot any longer borrow from international markets.
But with the IMF coming into play, Dr. Anila,
they will give us confidence. They will give, they will give potential investors confidence, but over time, till the credit rating from where it is now, where we are.
How long are we looking at? Because usually debt restructuring process takes around 36 months, Udar.
So if it's done properly, it can be done in 9 months,
right?
And it can take up to 36 months. So I'm taking like the sort of averages, the market within a few years. And as we're not already in the market, it makes no sense not to go through this process.
Right. So
and Shamir, there is something, sorry to interject, very important, because I have had these conversations with some of the creditors. They basically want us to restructure. Counterintuitive, they want us, because what their argument is that the longer you delay this, our loss is increasing, right? So our people think that basically no, we should keep our goodwill. They jolly well know that we cannot pay. It's only a question of time. So they actually are a major proponent for us to restructure, because they know the longer it takes, the bigger the pain for them.
And the credibility, either you default because you're forced to default, or you make a plan to defer the payment.
Right.
So the entire credibility of the country is now at stake.
Dr. Dunasika, now interestingly we spoke about the All Party Conference that the government is having next week, and most of the parties are not attending. That's what we hear at the moment from the news that are coming out in the recent past. When the two ministers who left the cabinet, Vimal Weerawansa and Udaya Gamampila, Vimal Weerawansa from the National Freedom Front, then Udaya Gamampila from the Pivituru Helorume, when they left the cabinet, or when they were fired from their portfolios, the government is not giving the picture, the right picture, to the other opposition parties to join hands, because they are of the opinion we won't listen. The arrogant behavior is very, very evident. So do you think political parties will unite for a common cause in a country like Sri Lanka if the government is not willing to heed their proposals?
I think that is what exactly has happened. Not just the political parties. Government has failed in communicating the real situation in the country to the public. Thereby, for example, we have various ways through which we could cut down the fuel consumption, even the electricity, and in various other areas. in order to make it happen, government must communicate it effectively, and certainly in some cases need to introduce certain alternatives. That is not happening. So unless you communicate the problem effectively to the public and the political parties are aware, I don't think that you need to communicate it further. But what is important is to get the public support at this juncture, at least to reduce. You mean the government, I mean it may not be able to fully solve the issue with the cooperation, but at least there are ways through which we could manage some of the things, electricity, fuel and other things, so that the partly we can have a solution through that ways.
Dr. Zuluska, what I don't understand is, let's take a look at the SLPP government. They have approximately 149 members in their side of parliament. And if you look at these members, not all of them are uneducated. Now there are people who say that we don't have a rupee crisis, however we have a dollar crisis. And then you have members in the cabinet who are saying that when a country gives you a loan, that loan comes in a ship. so we have cabinet members who have made such assumptions, and you have their advice as well. Shouldn't that process begin within the government itself? You don't have to look outside. You have good people within the government.
But I think you have enough evidence to suggest that what we can say, the mentality of the ruling, the key political figures, finance minister and the prime minister and the president, and as in the case of when they governed previously, they concentrated the entire power within a family. And even if you look at the budgetary allocation, nearly 70 to 80% of the money went into the ministries, which were governed by the governor, or basically administered by their family members. So I think this is also the same. Even if you have many, shall we say, experienced, matured politician, at the end of the day, this government is centered around the family member.
You're talking
it's
about,
not a secret.
You're talking about experienced, matured politicians, and right now what the country needs is like consistency in policy and vision for the future. Just something to sort of gauge what experience and maturity has done for our parliamentarians. There are members of parliament who voted for the 17th, the 18th, the 19th, and the 20th amendments to the Constitution.
Yeah.
That's their experience and maturity.
Yeah. That is actually, that is politics. Again, we must say, as in order to survive in the game, they change the color in that way.
All diametrically opposed to
each. Yeah, we cannot expect a very, kind of idealistic behavior. But whatever,
no, what I'm saying is it's not even idealist. It's like just, they don't have a basic. If our guest from last week was here, he'd probably walk out because I'm disrespecting elected representatives. But they don't even have a basic understanding of principles of governance, not about whether they are left-wingers or right-wingers or alt-right or anarchists, or not talking about their ideologies. They don't have a basic, it appears they don't have, when you look at the decisions that they make, it appears they don't have a basic understanding of principles of governance.
No, it is simply, it is not, run by on principles, on policies. Politics are not done on the basis of the policies. Simply they support one or the other, one party or the other in order to get the position. They do not debate policies now.
Right.
They just look at the what we call that Pasupela Mantri in the
backbenchers.
Backbenchers in the ruling party. See, listen to their media statement. What things they just speak about.
And it's a very feudalistic sort of place.
Dr. very quickly, how the Kontra
I think we need to wait and see. And one thing I think we need to specify: this is not certainly the right time to make this a political kind of a game changer. However, if we are to move forward in the medium term, we need a leader who really, what we call believe in market principles.
Right. So I want to quickly move to Udara before I go into the final round of the show tonight. Udara, let's talk a little bit about the Russian conflict and how it's affecting Sri Lanka. We all know right now Visa, MasterCard, SWIFT has been cancelled. And how will the Sri Lankans who have exported goods to Russia receive their money? Through which channels?
So as I understand it, there's an alternative system to SWIFT, which the Russian banks will get engaged with. There's also another interbank payment system within Russia, which I think is integrated with China. But in general, right now, there's different laws coming in, which is definitely at the very least going to delay payments. Now, so in this situation, the exporters here are in trouble because they don't have access to dollar credit lines anyway to sustain this. So this is a role that the government and the diplomatic agencies can potentially help with, trying to work out a way to facilitate the trade without contravening any direct sanctions which Sri Lanka needs to abide by. And I think in this climate, it's important to that Sri Lanka looks at, balances both the sides of the Western requirements, the Western concerns, the Western sanctions, as well as what Sri Lanka needs in this time itself.
Right. So, Udara, recently we saw the manner in which a request was made by the Russian government for a grant to strengthen the country's economy as well. But we also know that the United States Assistant Political Affairs Assistant Secretary of State is arriving in Sri Lanka also. In all this, is Sri Lanka sandwiched in between all this? Because we have India trying to tell us what to do now because they have given us a big grant. Now China is saying that they want to give us 2.5 billion dollars. Then you have Russia trying to twist our arm with regard to not giving our support to the Ukrainians. Then you have the Western world, the West, the US coming and telling us what to do. So what is our predicament at the end of the day?
So the predicament is, it depends what the objective here is. If the objective is to not to create enemies, I think this will end up creating enemies. If the objective here is to try and work out what is the best outcome for Sri Lanka, this means talking to each of the parties and trying to work out how all of these potential deals can coexist. And I say this in the same way that Singapore's always brought up, but Singapore was managed to successfully negotiate difficult partners that were polar opposites, and that's from having the view and the vision that we need to do what's best for our country first. And so I'm not saying that we need to do deals with Russia. What I'm saying is that we need to be good at negotiating. We need to be able to understand how to weigh up these two options and allow them both to coexist. So I see this more as an opportunity rather than being sandwiched or being at a cost to us.
Right. So if you look at it, Udara, if you look at the recent past, the Sri Lankan rupee was quite strengthened against the ruble. At least that's some sort of hope. At least we're doing somewhere well.
Well, the ruble appreciated about 50% within a week as well. So now I think it's
now it's a different story altogether. But at the end of the day, how would the Russian importers who have bought Sri Lankan goods pay back the country? Because this has been a major issue for Sri Lankan exporters, especially the tea industry. We are exporting a lot of tea to Russia. When the ruble depreciates in Russia against the USD, it has a big impact on the exporter. There are defaults that takes place. In a situation like that, what is your message to the exporters?
So I don't know the exact mechanics, but tea is an international commodity. It should be priced in dollars. And I know the price of tea in Russia do fluctuate with the world price of tea. So the ruble exchange rate, the rupee exchange rate really shouldn't matter. Now, of course, if the dollar price of world tea falls, it's bad for exporters, but it shouldn't depend on Russia. I think the thing that the government, Sri Lankan government, should really work out and deal with, make an arrangement, is how to get liquidity out of Russia at some point. It may not be now, maybe it's in 6 months. But in that 6 months, how do we bridge this difficult period for the export? But this requires, a policy which is very clear on that we want to be able to service this market. And that is not a difficult, that's a difficult decision to make. Given the political climate in the West, how the West sees Russia, this is something that needs to be dealt with very delicately.
Right. Thank you very much, the gentleman and the lady, for thoughts in the first and the second round. We're going for a short commercial break. Our discussion today is revolving around the country's economy. We are almost in the verge of the final round. We'll come back to you momentarily after the short commercial break. Stay connected, stay with Face the Nation. We will be right back.
COVID-19 සඳහා ආරක්ෂිත පියවර. නිතරම හොඳින් සබන් යොදා දෑත් සෝදන්න. සබන් හෝ විසබීජනාශක මධ්‍යසාරයක් භාවිතා කර දෑත් පිරිසිදු කරන්න. සැම විටම අන් අය සමග මීටරයක දුරස්ථභාවයක් පවත්වා ගන්න. හැකි සෑම විටම නිවසේ රැඳී සිටින්න. නිරතුරුවම නිවැරදිව මුඛාවරණ පළඳින්න.
Supporting rural education means building a nation's future. And together with the people of Sri Lanka, Gammadda is leading from the front. Development of preschools in Ramba Ava and Isin Basagama, both in rural Anuradhapura. A preschool developed in Attan Kadavala in the North Central Province. Clean drinking water for the children of the Maligattena School in Valimata, Bandarvela. A library for the youngsters at the Kumbuk Oya Rural School between rural Polonnaruwa and Matale. Clean water for school children in Hambegamua, Munragala. Classrooms for students at the primary school in Ralapanava, Anuradhapura. The complete development of the Sindati Mata School in Kalpitiya, Puttalam. These are a few examples of Gammadda's action and impact. Thanks to you, the people. Gammadda. By the people, for the people.
Stand by, final round, no questions asked. Welcome back. This is Face the Nation. We are in the final round. Let's start off the final round with Professor Udara Piris, Professor of Finance, National Research University, High School of Economics, Moscow, a member of the Research Advisory Board of the Central Bank of Russia. The time starts now. What is the way forward?
So the way forward is to first have direct responsibility at the top. So the President really needs to take upon all of these responsibilities from the Central Bank and Finance Ministry. All the decisions need to be done through him. I think he needs to make a set of plans together with experts from places like the IMF. And these plans are well known. There aren't many details that are unknown specific to Sri Lanka. And to come up with a clear time frame to say that this is the steps we're going to do. First, are we going to restructure or not? If so, when? And what are the basic premises? And this can be done in 2 weeks. And in 2 weeks, if this is done, this will immediately bring a lot of confidence into the market and to the economy. And from that, we can start moving forward. Alternatively, if these simple things are not done, we're looking at 20 years and several rounds of default. This whole generation will be lost. And this I see really as the same parallels as a time of war. And this is the severity of the situation. We need to have very strong leadership at this time.
Thank you very much, Udara Peiris, Professor of Finance, National Research University, High School of Economics, Moscow. Dr. Priyanka Dunasinghe, Senior Lecturer, Department of Economics, University of Colombo.
I think as it is clear now, at the moment with the higher inflation, there is a pressure and frustration in the economy, and with the IMF conditions or the program, I am sure that the things will be difficult for, in particular, for the poor people in coming month or coming years. And in that context, it is important that government front load or maybe to initiate some at least the livelihood development programs prior to initiating the IMF program in order to support those who are really in need, and at the same time to make the IMF program more politically sustainable program. Otherwise, this could lead to a kind of a very what we call the kind of political crisis, thereby having a bigger impact and getting into a bigger crisis than where we are right now. So it is very important, given the now when we listen to the those who joined today on Zoom technology, it is quite clear not just the low income, but even the middle income people are in a, not in a good mood today. So I think it is very important while planning this restructuring. It is important to think how to at least redress some of the poor people and middle income. Government certainly could tap some of the internationally available maybe NGOs, INGOs and other donors for that exercise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Priyanka Dunasinghe. Dr. Ainadas Bandaranaike, former Assistant Governor, Central Bank of Sri Lanka.
I support what the other two said, and I think the stability and the confidence building is critical. I also think that while this economic mess is being sorted out in the ways they said, we cannot neglect all the other, we've put everything on the back burner that has to be addressed in this country because of the current immediate crisis. So I think it is also important that we look at the other areas that we have to address, the longer term structural, and this includes information systems. Now when we talk about the poor, I think we have to push for information from the household income and expenditure survey to be put out. The government is not, I think, allowing the census department to put out these data, and those are essential if we want to know who the vulnerable are, whether it's the poor, the middle, those data have to be put out, and we have to get all that socioeconomic information out in order for us to make the policies and take policy decisions along this path. So I think I would say information is critical for this exercise if we are to do evidence-based policy decisions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ainadas Bandaranaike, Murtaza Jafarji Chair, Advocate Institute.
9 months ago, I was on this program and I said that Sri Lanka is going to have a mother of all crises. This crisis has started. I'm afraid that things are going to get far worse before it gets any better. And Trishan asked this question, what do you tell people, the younger generation who want to leave the country? And I said earlier on in this program that I'm optimistic because this is a great opportunity for a reset. Old people do not create change. It is the idealistic youth that bring about transformation in the country. So we have to start by asking the question, what is the nature of our state? Our country's official name is the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka. For a moment, let me examine each of these words. We say we are democratic. Yes, we have elections where we have large number of turnout. But do we have the best and brightest in our country who is running this nation? So we have to ask fundamental questions whether the electoral system gets the best players in the country to lead us. And perhaps we have to think about a system where we have more accountable local representatives of first past the post, and we have a proportionate representation, something similar to the German system where you have 2 votes. 1 vote to your local politician and they can come from any other party. The best man for the job, best man or woman. And the second vote is for the party. The second part is we are also have the name socialist. The question we have to ask is what kind of socialism does our country have? I mean, taxes are the backbone that allows redistribution. We have given lifetime tax holidays, we have given 15-year tax holidays, we have excluded the rich people, excluded discretionary items from being VATable. Do we spend on defense and civil security more than what we spend for education and healthcare? Is this the kind of socialism we want, or we need to have a different kind of welfareism where everybody has a fair go in life? And then I come to the question of the republic. I take the cry from the French Revolution, egalite, fraternity, liberté. Egalite means that egalitarian. We have too much of feudalistic politics. We excessively respect seniority. We should flatten our power structure so that people are respected on a meritocratic basis, irrespective of who your clan is or who your father is or how many years you have been in a particular position. We have to ask about liberty, which means that I have a right to consume what I want to consume. I don't have to be restricted by controls and licenses. I need to be able to say what I want to say. We shouldn't be saying, get on WhatsApp and call each other because we fear somebody is listening to our calls. And finally, we have to have fraternity, which means brotherhood. We must identify our Sri Lankanness, not divided by ethnicity, because if we only come together, can we ever come out of this crisis? So I leave it to the young people. You are the change. You remain in this country and be the change so that Sri Lanka comes out of this crisis and we prosper going forward.
Thank you very much, Murtaza Jafarji, Chair of the Advocata Institute, Dr. Anila Bandaranaike, former Assistant Governor, Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Professor Udara Peris, Professor of Finance, National Research University, Hayek School of Economics, Moscow, a member of the Research Advisory Board of the Central Bank of Russia, Dr. Priyanka Dunasinghe, Senior Lecturer in Department of Economics, University of Colombo. Thank you very much to the gentleman and the lady who joined us via Zoom, Angelo De Silva, Dr. Ruwan Veerasinghe, Lalit Dasanaika, Trehan Munasinghe, and also Menaka Mayadunna for joining us tonight on Face the Nation. Thank you very much, Nadeem. Thank you very much Faraz for joining us this evening on the show, because you are on the show tonight. Who's your guest tomorrow on Newsline?
Well,
still thinking.
No, we have we have a Member of Parliament from the SJB, Eran Wickramaratne.
Right. So looking forward for that discussion for us. What is it going to be centered around?
There can only be one. And that is the present crisis.
I'll leave it tonight with a quote, as I always do. To overcome the flaws of the economic crisis in our society, we need to envision our social life. We have to free our mind. We need to imagine things to make them happen. If you don't imagine, it will never happen, because at the end of the day, there's always a light and of a dark tunnel. Take care and good night.